What do you consider the most important benefits, risks and governance challenges of clinical research that involves germline genome editing?
In relation to genome editing, there are a number of important benefits, and those are, in my opinion, to human health. So there's the potential to, both in people who have an existing condition, to potentially treat that with somatic therapies, and then there is also the possibility of preventing children being born with a genetic condition that's otherwise perhaps blighted their family for generations. So there are really important medical issues here that could be resolved by genome editing, but we're still at the stage where we don't know enough about genome editing to use it particularly in germline therapies in clinical practice, because in order to do something that affects a future person and then future generations, we have to be very much reassured by the scientific community about the safety and the efficacy of such treatments, because what we'll be trying to achieve is to avoid conditions and not to inadvertently create children who've got perhaps not that condition anymore, but have got something else that is a medical problem instead as a result of actions we've taken. So there's a lot to do there for scientists, and we're really at the beginning of that research. So there are risks around this, as I've said, in relation to making sure that these treatments are safe.
What problems do you expect to emerge from global differences in regulatory rules and regulatory cultures in this technology field?
If the scientists can demonstrate that these are worthy techniques to be used in clinical practice in people, how do we go about regulating that? What checks and balances do we need in place so that scientists and medical doctors or clinicians can operate within boundaries that they fully understand and know what the limits are? And how do we also then make sure that there is follow-up from the first children that are born from this, so we can check that their future health looks good, and perhaps that of future generations. So there are lots of issues that need to be looked into, and I would say that the main way that we need to do this at the moment is by talking about these things. So by having public dialogue, public engagement work around what genome editing can promise, what the genome editing may achieve that we would not be comfortable with as a society, so-called enhancements. So it may be that we're all quite happy for something such as Huntington's to be treated, but when it comes to something else, it may be much more of a grey area, such as short-sightedness or genes in relation to autism spectrum disorders. And then there could be ones that we think are simply, that they could be moot points. It may be then that there are ones that we think absolutely no way. We don't need to create children who have, say, perfect pitch or some sort of fantastic sporting ability. So those are all issues for us to be talking about and to be fed into government and into the policymakers and into the regulator, so that they can start to take soundings on this and think about how, if we want to move this way as a society, how we can do it in a measured and responsible way, how we can do it in an appropriate way so that it's not overly burdensome on scientists, but there is still some oversight, and how ultimately patients can benefit from these technologies. There could be problems, and I suspect there will be problems, as these technologies emerge at different paces in different countries, where there are different regulatory frameworks or no regulatory framework where there are lots of laws, where there are no laws, and people will therefore have different latitudes to perhaps proceed at different paces with science. But it may be because of the nature of how scientific research is published that then other scientists in an area where there is a legal void then decide, oh, well, we will now do this because we can, whereas in another country they can't. And that then creates problems because it can risk patient safety. It can also mean that there is a secrecy around the scientific work that is done. So the ability to reproduce it, to understand the methodology involved, is severely limited. And that doesn't help the scientific community, and it doesn't ultimately help patients. So what we need, I think, well, actually I don't think, but there's what we need and what is achievable. It would be fantastic if there could be some sort of international agreement over this, but I don't think that is a possibility. But if there could be regulations or recommendations put out by international professional bodies about what is expected of people working in this field, that would be perhaps a small step forward in this. And that then if people are seen to break those, although they perhaps wouldn't have any sanctions attached, there could be sanctions attached to those by professional bodies or by these international bodies that wouldn't have any great weight in terms of, they wouldn't be sending people to prison or issuing huge fines, but it could put, a black mark on their career going forward. So that would be one way. And we've seen in other areas of science where there have been developments in one country and this has happened. People have gone to somewhere where there is no framework, such as with mitochondrial donation. The first mitochondrial donation baby was born in Mexico. And so there are all sorts of ethical implications about that. But there's also, it's created problems in Mexico now in relation to their legislation now going forward. And so they're going to have more reactionary, oppressive legislation than they would have had if that had not taken place. So there are all sorts of repercussions that can happen if people do this sort of forum shopping with their scientific research or treatment. And that's something that, will require some international cooperation, although, as I've said, I'm not optimistic that any sort of proper framework will come out of that would have any teeth.